we were talking a little bit about uh, how you've always loved learning.
For some reason or other, I always enjoyed accomplishing,
Yeah.
doing things.
Uh huh.
I, I valued being first in the class.
Yeah.
I never was, but came close once or twice.
Uh huh.
And I liked mathematics and I liked reading, and I did a lot of reading. Uh, well, I would say kind of uh, thinly,
Yeah. What do you mean?
not getting deep into it, just kind of reading through it fast as I could.
Through like a textbook?
Well, I did read names are hard to come by, but my mother was horrified that I read Gone with the Wind when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
She felt it was too sexy. Uh, and I, who's the famous Russian writer? Tolstoy.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, he wrote a book on war and peace,
Mm.
and I insisted on reading that. But it's so full of details. By the time I got through, I couldn't really remember it.
It's a long. I mean, it's like this thick, isn't it?
It's a thick book.
Yeah. It's probably more than I have read in my whole life. That book.
I read a number of books while I was in high school, kind of like reading for the purpose of reading, for having read.
Yeah, I do that too. I like almost as if it's like another notch on my belt.
An accomplishment.
Yes, an accomplishment. I
Yeah.
love that. And I do that exact same thing. I listen to books. I do a lot of driving, so I love to listen. And that's actually how I remember, which is why I like to do this, because I like to listen to things.
Okay.
And so I listen to books all the time, and a feeling that I have progressed and that I've kind of downloaded more information into my brain
Yeah.
is almost addictive. That might not be the right word, but it's definitely gives you a dopamine rush to know that you're smarter today than you were yesterday.
Yes. That's exactly the feeling somehow. I was born with that, or you were born with that.
Yeah.
Uh, a drive to succeed.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. That is something I very much relate to. And I asked you that because I have thought about that with myself. Why do I love to learn and I have a drive to succeed as well. And so trying to understand that, I've talked to my dad about it and my brothers, and I'd like to get your take on that. I guess, what does that mean to you personally, a drive to succeed? And do you have any thoughts on where that comes from within you?
I think my father had it.
Yeah.
He was a farm boy in Provo, Utah,
Uh-huh.
and he drove himself uh, in in a college that didn't exist, and he taught classes in that college.
Mhm.
Then he went on to get a PhD at Chicago,
Mhm.
and he did the original work for which Robert Millikan got the Nobel Prize,
The a drop experiment or something like that?
oil drop
Oil
experiment.
drop experiment. That was your father.
That was my father.
And your father, my great grandfather, is Harvey,
That's
right?
right.
Um, they just gave him, was it a Grammy for sound?
Yes, he
It's
did
cool.
that at Bell Laboratories after he went to work.
Wow. So he got a Grammy after he died. A long, I mean, when
Yes,
did he died? A long time ago, right? Before I was born, most
yes,
likely.
probably.
Um, what I've heard about him is he's got a Grammy. His professor got the Nobel Prize for something that they worked on together,
Yes,
right? Um, he he was integral in, was it Stereophonic sound?
yes.
And what did he do for that?
He invented it.
He invented it.
Yeah.
Seems like a pretty big deal.
Well, he was in charge of a research group at Bell Laboratories,
Mhm,
and they poked into acoustics.
mhm.
And he wrote a book, Speech and Hearing,
Okay.
which I think is a classic book on that subject. It was reissued 20 years later. Uh, that's what he did right after he retired.
Mhm.
Uh, so there's no question but that he had that bug that we talked about.
Yeah.
He worked hard and curious.
Uh-huh.
So I think I would say I probably got that from him.
Yeah.
And some of my brothers to some extent also.
Mhm.
Of the four younger brothers, all have a PhD.
Wow.
Three of them in physics, one in math.
And your dad also had a PhD.
Yes, he did. He got it in a year and a half. When he got married and took the train to Chicago, not knowing whether he could get in or not
Mhm,
to the University of Chicago,
mhm.
which was one of the foremost physics departments in the United States. And he was accepted by Millikan and, as I said, did that oil drop experiment. So he got his PhD in about a year and a half,
Wow.
even though he didn't have all the requirements uh, of an undergraduate. But he went back and taught at the BYU for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years.
Mhm,
Then accepted a job at Bell Laboratories, Bell Telephone Laboratories.
mhm.
Uh, he tells a story that the president of the university told him, "You're going to regret leaving the BYU. Your children will all leave the church." And so he uh, inquired of the president of the church when he visited the BYU,
Uh-huh.
and the president of the church said, "Go and make an impression. If you stay active in the church, your family will too."
Mhm.
And they did.
Yeah.
They stayed in the church.
And didn't your brother end up being the president of the University of Utah at one point?
Yes,
I was reading about it the other day. I wanna say same brother worked for NASA as well, right?
He was the head of NASA.
Head of NASA. So if we were making
He came. He left the University of Utah to take that job,
wow.
and then after they had a change in presidency and
Mhm.
a new head of the NASA,
Mhm.
and they ran into trouble with Challenger,
Mhm.
and they called him back in the head of it, and he had the job of straightening out the problem.
Mhm.
So
So if you had to make a resume, um, just for someone who didn't know about your family, your siblings,
yeah,
you go through it and you've said your dad invented stereophonic sound. Um, he worked on a project that won the Nobel Prize. Um, your brother was the head of NASA, the president of the University of Utah. Um, what would you say about you? What do you think someone would want to know as far as like bullet points?
bullet points.
Yeah.
Uh, I was I got a MIT, get a PhD from MIT.
Uh huh.
Uh, Rose to a uh, director at the Bell Telephone Laboratories
Mm-hmm.
in a number of subjects, including uh, microwave devices.
Mm-hmm.
Discovered a number of new physics phenomena in semiconductors.
Mm-hmm. Is that what you talked about last time?
Did I have forgotten?
I don't remember. It goes over my head.
That's kind of inverse order. I did that first
Uh-huh.
as a starting scientist and then was promoted. In some ways, I'm sorry I did that.
Really? Why is that?
I enjoyed that research
Yeah.
much more than the administration.
And explain to me again what that is. What you're talking about with the semiconductors.
Uh, a semiconductor is an insulator which you add impurities to, and it becomes conducting,
Okay.
electrical, electrical
Uh huh.
conducting, and it becomes electrical conducting by the impurities embedded in the semiconductor, and it's a charged ion, and it's compensated by an electron in a conducting band that's able to move through the crystal.
Mm-hmm.
So it becomes conducting because of the impurity that you add.
Okay.
And so what I discovered was um, the spin resonance, the fact that the electron that's attached to the semiconductor has an electron spin, which you can detect with electromagnetic fields.
Mm-hmm.
And I discovered that
Wow. Is that work that you did in the
Bell
was it
Laboratory.
Bell Laboratories? Is that the when you talk about the radiation or the radiology? I don't remember laboratories that you worked in. Is that what that is?
The MIT radiation laboratories.
Uh-huh.
I worked there during the war,
Right.
in between getting a undergraduate degree and going on to graduate school.
Uh-huh.
I so I spent the Second World War at the MIT Radiation Laboratory.
And what did you do there?
I worked on magnetrons. Magnetron was a vacuum tube which generated microwave energy. Microwave is 10 centimeters
Mhm.
wavelength. So there was nothing that generated it. That particular, it generated a large pulse of energy at that frequency. And that was useful during the war to detect submarine snorkels
Mhm.
because it had that short wavelength
Uh-huh.
and could detect a snorkel in the presence of waves in the ocean. So the German submarines could submerge so that the only thing that was showing above the water was that snorkel.
Mhm.
And they could charge their batteries with air drawn in from the snorkel. And, and so they didn't have to surface in order to charge their batteries. That means that they could be detected. So that's what they were used for. What I did was discovered a problem with those microwave generators.
Okay.
And that the problem was they didn't always operate in a mode that produced energy down a waveguide or into an antenna.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes they operated in a mode which didn't emit any energy, just operated internally.
Okay.
We called it double moded because I operated in two different modes. And I worked on why did it do that,
Interesting.
and derived a method of avoiding it.
Mhm.
So
Oh, that's our timer. Um, Now after, so that was kind of more beginning of your professional life, right?
uh, partly it happened early in my life, but I did things before that.
Right, right. So just rounding out, I know you talked about some of the other things that you had done that you feel would be kind of bullet points as far as accomplishments go, things that you feel proud of. As far as career wise, what are the things that you're most proud of that you haven't already mentioned? No, you talked about the a couple of the scientific articles that you've had published.
Yes.
What were those about? What were those on?
Um, Mostly they were on aspects of microwave devices,
Okay, so similar vein to what you had already worked on.
which I had worked on during the war.
Hmm.
And when I joined Bell Laboratories,
Hmm.
I continued to work on some of those
Okay.
and published some articles. But one of the things which I did, I think probably the foremost piece of physics that I published on
Uh huh.
was the detection of the spin of the electron attached to the impurities that I talked about
Uh huh.
in the semiconductors. And it turned out that they, if they weren't too concentrated, separate from each other,
Hmm.
they had different orientations with respect to the magnetic field.
Hmm.
And that was already known that the impurities we added had a magnetic moment which interacted with the electron magnetic moment, causing different orientation. Different different orientations had a different frequency.
Hmm.
So, for instance, The first one was antimony impurity that we added to silicon. Antimony was an element which had a, a, a nucleus magnetic moment
Mm-hmm.
of one spin, which means it had two possible orientations in
Okay.
the magnetic field. And so when we added antimony to a semiconductor and, and detected the spin
Mm-hmm.
of that electron, it had two pulses, two frequencies,
Mm-hmm.
depending upon which way the was oriented with respect to the nucleus.
Mm-hmm.
So, arsenic
Uh-huh.
also can be added as an impurity. It has three possible four possible orientations. Spin of three. No, that's not right either. But it has four possible orientations.
Mm-hmm.
And when we put that in the magnetic resonance detector, it had four pulses, just as you predict.
Right. Right.
And then we tried antimony.
Uh-huh.
Antimony has two isotopes. One was six orientation, and the other with eight. Total of 14.
Mm-hmm.
Sure enough, we had detected all 14 resonances. That was probably the greatest physics accomplishment.
Yeah. Was that something at a young age that you fantasized about? Do you have like did you have a childlike imagination towards physics?
I don't know if I call it towards physics, but I did have a great deal of interest of the way basically things worked.
Okay. As a child. Oh, I keep
Well,
doing that.
certainly by high school anyway.
Yeah. So you're saying maybe engineering as well or construction?
I had thought maybe engineering as a career,
Mm-hmm.
but I was much more interested in physics, the way things worked, rather than the ability to make things work.
So the way things work at their most rudimentary level. So not just the way things work like the way a car works, but more the way things work like the way an atom works or the way that
Well, yeah, I was also interested in the way a car
uh-huh.
theoretically works,
Uh-huh.
not the latest design.
Right. Like it's makeup.
I wanted to know what a cylinder was and why the number of
Mm-hmm.
pulses it had.
So you're a naturally very curious person then.
I'm a natural,
Curious person.
naturally curious.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Anything that goes into your drive to succeed, like you said before, it's part of just a curiosity about the world.
it certainly is a part of the curiosity,
Mm-hmm.
part of this the desire to succeed. I think it's something else.
It has to do with growing up with brothers, growing up in a competitive environment, or your dad.
Maybe,
Yeah.
maybe have something to do with that.
Were you competitive in your childhood
I
towards
was
your
always competitive, yes.
and they were competitive as well, your siblings?
Particularly my brother, just older than I.
Yeah, that seems to be the way it is.
And anyway, as teenagers, we fought all the time.
Yeah. Fought physically, verbally,
Some,
a little both.
but mostly we were just antagonistic to each other.
Okay. And how did that develop in adulthood?
We separated. Well, we roomed. My parents insisted that we room together at BYU the 1 year I spent there,
Mhm.
and that was not pleasant. We just didn't get along. I would suppose I was jealous of him, and he was jealous of me.
Yeah.
Particularly, I was better at schoolwork. I got better grades.
Uh-huh.
But when we got out of school, he succeeded in his business world much better.
Okay.
At any rate, by the time he was ready to die, we had made up.
How long ago did he die?
He died when he was 71.
Oh, so, like, a long time ago.
I
Maybe
would have been I
20,
would have been 69.
so 30 years ago.
Now I'm 98. Yeah, 30 years.